All right, what's good, y'all? This is Fred Johnson, the fourth, Mr. I'm gonna graduate, your favorite college success coach. And y'all, I got another amazing podcast interview for y'all. Welcome to the College Access and Career Podcast, College Access and Persistence Podcast. I'm here with Dr. Devin Walker. Y'all, look, he got a number of titles, so I want to make sure I get them all correct. He's the director of the Sweat Center for Black Males and the director of global leadership and social impact at the University of Texas, Austin. He is also the CEO and founder of World Walker LLC. Dr. Walker, how are you doing today?
Brother, I'm great, man. Great to be here with you, man. Love the work you're doing. So honored to be on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you. Look, I'm excited to pick your brain. Of course, if this is your first time tuning in, I bring on leaders in both the secondary and higher education spaces to pick their brain, not just about the great things that they're doing, but how we can continue to improve. How can we get better at collaboration, sharing their best practices so that we can continue to improve outcomes for the students that we serve. So Dr. Walker, the first thing I really want to know, I'm always interested in people's journey. And I know higher education is a space where there are a ton of pockets where there aren't a ton of Black males. And so I'm very interested to learn more about your journey, why you chose education, and how you got to where you are today.
Where do I start? So I would say my first job when I was 14 was actually at a preschool. I just wanted to work. Growing up in LA, wanted a little bit of money in my pocket, help my family, at least so that they didn't have to overly support me. So I got work at a preschool, loved it. It was easy, playing with little kids. But I think when most of my jobs been in education. And then after that, I worked at a summer camp. And then, when I was going to college, I got this organization called the Posse Foundation. I got a scholarship to go to college through that. And what I really appreciated about that experience is that each week we'd have these meetings, and it was a diverse group of kids from LA. We were all going to go to college together. And we would talk about these different topics. So it might be race, politics, class, gender, sexuality, whatever, right? And that's when I really started valuing like conversation and differences of opinion and all that stuff, to be honest. And I remember we were actually visiting Wisconsin my senior year, and we had a conversation on gender. And this is one of the most important conversations, or at least instrumental conversations in my life. So they separated the boys and the girls, and the boys went, and we were talking, and we had the male facilitator, so he's getting us all comfortable. And I remember there was a prompt around like, would you vote for a female president? And I went off like, nah, they're emotional, da-da-da. I'm 17-year-old, and I fell in line with the larger dominant narratives about gender roles, right? And gender stereotypes, specifically of women. And I was speaking it. And then we all came back together and we're facilitating conversation. And then the facilitator looks at me, he's like, yeah, man, what were you saying like 30 minutes ago though? And I'm like, oh man. And it was just a very powerful moment for me because I grew up all brothers. So I never, in that moment, I'm like, man, these are like your sisters, your homegirls. Are you really about to say what you just said? Well, do you really believe what you just said? And it forced me to question a lot of things. And I think that's what opened my mind to like education around like social studies, culture, gender, and that stuff. So I majored in sociology, history, women and gender studies was my minor in college. And that conversation really stimulated that, as well as some other conversations I had freshman year when, people called me on my right? Like I needed to grow, I needed to develop as it related to gender and sexuality. So I did. I took the classes and they blew my mind. I was so uncomfortable freshman year. I remember this. I remember sitting in the back, not talking, never. And then in discussion class, when you're actually supposed to talk, I would just sit back there and, about a month, didn't say nothing. But I would always have these thoughts. I just keep it to myself. And, you walk out, you'd be like, oh, they said this, but they ain't thinking this. They ain't thinking this. But I was too afraid to voice those things in class. Similarly, like I was afraid to voice what I had just said once the women were back in our small little posse group. So I was like, all right, let me speak my truth. So I came in a discussion class the following week and I'm like, I am about to say my piece. I'm about to say something. And I did. Yeah. And everybody was excited. Like as soon as I raised my hand, everybody was like, oh, this dude's finally gonna speak. Cause it's mostly women in the class. And man, when I spoke, like 7 hands shot up after, and I was like, oh man, I just said something ridiculous. And I got checked, I got challenged, I got pushed, I got confronted, and I walked out. And I was sitting there, and I didn't have those same thoughts in my head. Now I was forced to grapple with my thoughts because I had finally put it out there for someone else to digest with. And man, I just remember that being one of the most powerful moments of my academic career, and it made me want to be an educator. Like, man, if I could help other people grow in the same way that I've been growing as it relates to my understanding of gender, sexuality, that's what it is. That's perfect. So I'll try to get through this briefly because that's the big story. I mean, big story. How did I get into education? So I studied abroad a lot. As when I was at Wisconsin, I'm like, it was cold, it was white. I was like, I need to get out of here. So I did that. I studied abroad 3 times: Canada, London, and South Africa. That's where I fell in love with international education and traveling. And went back, worked for the Posse Foundation once I graduated college. So I was a trainer, so I would help lead these same conversations that were so impactful on my own journey. And after 3 years, that travel bug was still on me. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to Korea. And I was going to teach. I taught English out there for about a year and a half, almost 2 years. I wanted to backpack Southeast Asia. That was always like a goal of mine. And since I had done some backpacking in Europe and in Africa, I'm like, all right, I'm going to go do this. But you can't afford to go backpacking Asia for 2 months, So I had to literally move everything. I had to, I was like, I got to move to Korea, save up money for a year, then I could do this experience. So I did that. Went back to Korea, taught a little more, applied to grad school, got to UT. And man, I would say once I got to UT, I've been here 10 years now, and just really catapulted me. I came for a master's. I was like, I'm gonna get in and get out. I found this dude who studied the intersection of race, sports, and identity, which is what I was interested in. Far too many of us get locked into the idea of being an athlete. Growing up, a lot of us say, oh, I want a college scholarship, I want a college scholarship. That's why we do it. But then you get the college scholarship and you ain't even barely a college student. You focus so much on athletics. So that's what I was interested in. Came here, and honestly, man, about a week in, and this is why I think the work you're doing is so important, because mentors and motivators, people who believe in you, can literally change your life. Literally, my first week here, the dude who I was going to have my grad assistantship with, he's like, yo, man, you be a bad mother with a PhD. I'm like, what? He's like, man, I'm telling you, man, you could get one here, man. I think you should get a PhD.
Wow.
And, I'm sitting with it. I'm looking around, all my peers that I'm working with, all other Black dudes getting a PhD, and I'm getting a master's. And so it just normalized it for me. And I'm like, oh, this dude is not that much smarter than me.
Yeah, right.
In fact, this dude definitely ain't smarter than me, right? I'm like making sense of the situation. And it was dope because we're all in community together. And for me, as an undergrad, when I saw Black PhD students, I'm gonna just be frank here, I didn't identify with the way they moved, the way they talked, the way they looked, the way they sounded. I didn't identify with any of it, right? I'm like, that is not me. I didn't know that I could be a PhD student and be like a regular Black dude, or be like normal and not a geek, right? And when I got to UT, so many of us around us who are doing that, studying the intersection of race, sports under Dr. Harrison, and also under the guidance and mentorship of Dr. Moore. And they created an incredible pipeline here, man. So about 18, I think, of us have gone through in the last 12 years, get PhD, Black men. I mean, it's incredible. Now that is no longer the case right now. We had our run and it's kind of wrapping up now. Yeah, man, that's really how I got into this work, or at least that's my journey. Once I was a PhD student here, the way I got connected, when I was applying to grad school and I'm trying to get this GA-ship, I got accepted. I called Dr. Moore. Somebody's like, yo, call this man. So I do. I'm in Vietnam backpacking. So we set up a call. So I go to a coffee shop, I'm there early, making sure the time zone is correct, making sure that, the internet's going to work. And I'm like, this is a big deal for me. I need to get some sort of assistance because I can't afford it. So I called this dude, or through Zoom or computer or whatever. And he's like, hey man, "No, man, I'm running around campus right now, man. Can I call you back?" And I start freaking out. I'm like, "No, you can't call me back. Like, I've been preparing for this interview." I'm like, in Vietnam, I'm backpacking. I don't know where I'm gonna be tomorrow. I'm gonna be in a different city. I don't know about the coffee. And I'm like, just this. He's like, "Whoa, slow down, man. Like, slow down." Like, "What you mean you in Vietnam?" I'm like, "Yeah, I'm backpacking in Vietnam right now." He's like, "For real?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "And you Black?" I'm like, "Yeah." He's like, "All right, man, I got a job for you." I'm like, "Really?" He's like, "Look, man, call this person, but I got a job for you. I want you to run my global stuff." All right, cool. So I arrived the following year as a grad student, and I've been running the global stuff here at UT for the Division of Diversity for the last 10 years. And last year, I took over also, in addition to that role, I took over the director of the Heman Sweat Center for Black Males. So those are my two primary roles. I also would teach here at UT. So the last 2 years, I had the privilege of teaching a 500-person class, which is so much fun. Students from across Texas and across the world, but mostly Texas. So just different perspectives, different point of views, and bringing them all into a class to talk about like sociocultural issues that they don't agree on is so much fun and it's so enriching. And yeah, man, that's pretty much my story.
Wow, that's an amazing story. You made me think of a bunch of different things. I'm thinking about a similar experience I had in college where I was an orientation leader and we did something called safe space training. And to just make you more aware about the experience of people who identify as LGBTQ. And I remember before that safe space training, I had some really at the time, messed up thoughts about a very closed mind about my beliefs and what should be done or shouldn't be done, or just beliefs in general. I remember after leaving that space, that was just an eye-opening moment, just to have more empathy, but also to realize, like, yeah, the way I was raised, coming up in a household that was, Catholic and very religious. There's some thoughts, and that's not to say there's things you can agree or disagree with, but I think in terms of the way I showed up and how I interacted with people that had different identities than I had was definitely not great. And so I'm curious, both how you have created that experience for the students that you've had the pleasure of teaching, and also we know with the legislation that has come down, what do you think are going to be some missed opportunities to create that experience for students, or what will be non-existent or challenged because of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, so one of the things I always encourage all students, despite their gender, I'm like, take a women's studies or intro to LGBTQ studies course. Like, we don't learn about the world nor ourselves through those lenses, through those perspectives, through those identities, and they matter, right? So like, at least you could take one class, right? Just like I think all white people should take an African American studies course, right? Like that. And if you're resistant to that, you really got to question it. Why are you resistant to learning about someone else's experience? And I think the same thing for us. Now, I think we can say that about a white person. We're like, yeah, why aren't you taking this? Like, you're tripping, right? But are we as reflective about ourselves and our own privileges, right? So when it comes to us as men, do we want to take a course focused on women? Why, right? When it comes to the LGBTQIA community, but for me, those are the transformational classes because they challenged me the most. They pushed me out of my comfort zone the most, and I grew the most. So I try to do the same as an educator, right? Like, for me as a man, a cisgender, heterosexual man, I know that when I speak on gender issues or issues dealing with the LGBTQIA community, my privilege in that space provides me the platform for people actually to listen. Now, if I'm up there, I'm talking about racial issues, and I know it because I do it. They're listening, but they're also like, yeah, you're a Black. We know what you think. But when I get up there and I start talking about gender issues, everybody's locked in like, whoa, as a man, he thinks that, right? Or like, so it's more about just using the privilege and the platform. And it's also not to suggest that I'm a saint or I've never contributed to misogyny, because I definitely have, and for years, right? And so that's part of the work is, right, like, I know what I've contributed to. I know things that have come out of my mouth. I know behaviors that I've done. So what do I do now? now that I'm aware, now that I can reflect, now that I know better, now that I know different, for me, one thing I could do is try to infuse those ideas into young men early enough as to where
Right.
they can, that way of thinking can help shape their the way they go into their professional identities, right? So,
Mhm.
you know, leading a center for men, I'm always talking about that stuff, and I think it's important
Yeah.
to talk about it and to normalize. You know, when I'm talking about like a lot of, obviously it's a group of men, so a lot of conversation is around, you know, gender, right? What does it mean
Yeah.
to be a man? What does it mean to deal with Black women? Da, 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 da.
Mm.
But also, you know, I'm like, all right, I can't be super heteronormative in the way I talk about things. So if I'm talking about your wife, I'm gonna say your husband, and I'm gonna force this group to get comfortable with me saying that. At first, there's some snickers,
Mm.
husband. All right. By the third time I say that, now it's less people laughing. So now my eyes go to who's actually laughing, and now you feel
Mm.
stupid because we could change the culture of a place if you lead in that way.
Right.
So that's been a big goal of mine, specifically running a male organization. Is like, how do we deconstruct and reconstruct masculinity in healthy ways,
Mhm.
without making men feel bad about being masculine? I don't think that's
Right.
helpful.
Right.
Um, Two, right? How do we become better men in our communities?
Mhm.
And a lot of that deals with gender, and a lot of that deals with the ways
Yeah.
we're socialized into what it means to be a Black man. So, um, man, it's fun work. It's been a very enjoyable work. Now you asked another question around like the legislation. So
Yeah.
SB 17, SB 18, they just passed in Texas. What that means is diversity, equity, and inclusion offices and
Mhm.
programs have been banned. So I work for a division of diversity. So ultimately, we're gonna have to change our name
Mhm.
first, and then we'll see after that if we're able to still carve out a place of value in the university or not. Right?
Mhm.
Once you change your name, you change your mission. Yeah.
Ah.
Right? Like
Yeah.
if you can't focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, you have to change your mission. Right? If we're built
Mhm.
that. So it'll be really interesting to see how all this plays out, and most
Yeah.
importantly, how it impacts student success, right?
Mhm.
That's the most important thing. Do students feel supported? Do they feel like they have people to go to across the spectrum at the university to support them? And when you start banning these types of offices, gender and sexuality center, they won't be under fire. My
Mhm.
organization, because it's for Black males, is going to be under fire. A lot of these organizations are going to be under fire, and
Wow.
after a year or two of, slowly stripping resources or getting the leaders out, right? For example,
Ah.
myself, I'll be leaving the University of Texas, largely because of the way when this legislation came down, me and my family had some important decisions to make, some options. And while we
Mhm.
stay here, I have a 16-year-old daughter. She should be completing high school here. But the legislation puts our future, like our
Mhm.
future ability to be successful here at a huge risk. Um, so we're out, and I think hopefully there's not more narratives like mine where people are leaving, because it's
Mhm.
going to negatively impact students, right? Like, um, but that
Yeah.
I do think people are going to continue to leave. So we'll see.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah, man. That's definitely tough. I'm curious, what would be your biggest push for white people in that space, or people that are not directly in diversity offices and may not have to leave, but still value the things that that office championed? What would be your biggest push for them?
I mean, that's a good question. I think when I think about some of the global programs I run, for example, right? Like last time
Mm-hmm.
I had about 44 students in South Africa, majority Black, but not exclusive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I had 3 or 4 white students on the trip. So in the last year, since we've came back, one of the
Mm-hmm.
white girls, she wrote an article for the student newspaper about why it's so important to go to study abroad destinations outside of Europe. So her
Mm,
experience expanded her mind. She was able to think about diversity, equity on a global scale, not just locally, but like
mm,
even the countries we go to speaks to who's going to enroll in the program, right?
mm-hmm.
So people want to ban this office, but look, this is a white woman who had a dope experience, and she came back. She didn't feel terrible on the program because she's run all Black people. She felt inspired and motivated to think about these stuff on a bigger level. Another kid, he was applying for a PhD program, and I wrote him a letter of rec, and he specifically asked me, because he was showing up really well, he was doing like some great allyship on the trip, and I made sure to acknowledge him for that. I'm like, dude, you've done a couple of things that really showcase your allyship, and I want to name that in front of everybody and how you're doing that as an example. And so he asked me, when he asked me to write his letter of rec, he wanted me to focus on his identity as a white man and strides and efforts that he's making to be an inclusive leader. And I'm like, dope, right? So I think for people who just see diversity, equity, inclusion as like, I don't know, I honestly, I don't even know what the argument is. I guess they're making arguments like we waste money. No, they're making arguments that it's like racist against certain people, right? Like reverse racism, and it's identity specific. And it's just, you know, it's the same cycle. It's the same narrative ideology. It replicates itself. Every time we make substantial gains, white power comes back and rejects, right? You could think about Reconstruction, when the most Black men, because women weren't allowed to get elected at that point, that's the most Black men ever elected to this point in day in state and federal positions, right, in the government during Reconstruction. So what's the response to that? Jim Crow, right? All right, we have the Civil Rights Movement. We have hella gains, 64, 65, voting rights, Civil Rights Act, right? Housing Rights Act. What happens in 68? Nixon gets elected, and he puts forth a Supreme Court that is super conservative, that really disrupts a lot of the gains that we made in the 60s. And some of those laws and case precedents that the Supreme Court put in are still negatively affecting it today, right? That's why they'll say like Black kids are just as segregated today as they were in the 50s, high school wise. So there was that response. Then you have Obama. And then you have this, again, this strong response, this white supremacist response, electing Trump, And even within, I would still consider this the Obama era, right? But even within this era, another thing, you have George Floyd, massive protest. That was the most protest that we've had in years, right?
Right.
Think about what has happened since 2020, the white nationalist movement in response to that. Like you see a Black man get murdered by a police officer, getting suffocated. We protest, we protest, we protest. And the problem is that they see young white people now coming over and protesting with us and realizing that there's some bridges to be built along class lines, around economic lines. And I think the powers that be are not comfortable with that. And that's why you see this current movement that we're in, the strong white backlash. It's always a backlash. Every time you make some movements, there's going to be a backlash. So to me, that's the moment we're in right now. But these baby boomers are dying off. They're old and they're white. And I think Republicans are really nervous right now about where they're going to get their base. It's so nervous that they're willing to actually change laws. They ain't playing fair no more. You know what I'm saying? It's clear the last couple of years, the game ain't gonna be played fair no more, because they realize like the population, their base is dwindling. I don't even know the question you asked me. I just somehow went on a tangent about white backlash.
That's all good. It was just around the push that you have for those white administrators that are still at schools, and those people who are champions of diversity that will be remaining at schools, things that they can do so that students aren't losing out on.
White folks need to talk to their immediate circle, their neighbors, their families, right? Because the reality in Texas is so Republican right now that it doesn't really matter what is white folks that are going to control what is literally the laws that are being made. So for me, my neighbor, he's Republican, conservative. We have a good relationship. Really nice to me. He's been extremely nice to me since I moved in. And so I made sure to, when I told him I'm leaving, I made sure to let him know why. Like, those laws that for you, that you're just aligning with whatever's Republican because of your identity, but not fully seeing how these things impact us. Like, you rock with me, you rock with my family, you know the type of work I do and the way I show up and treat people. You think I'm a good person, but you don't see me when you see these diversity, equity, inclusion bills. you just see
Right.
like anti-whiteness, I think, because you watching Fox News, your whole you're gonna be distorted. So I make sure to talk to the people in and around me, and I think that's what more white folks need to do, is to share about what actually it is, what is their actual experience with some of these bills, and to help maybe make folks more aware of what is and what isn't. Because these bills are going to negatively impact the university. They're negatively impact the education of all the students, right? I'm a hell of an educator, I'll be honest. I'm not there no more. I'm not teaching 500 students. And I can tell by my, my rate professor or whatever, they like the class. Like they like being able to be in a space where we're talking about very uncomfortable things, but somehow I'm containing it, right? I'm holding it. I'm creating space for people to disagree and engage and laugh and cry and all those emotions, we experience. So I think you're going to continue to lose quality educators of color in Texas, professors specifically. Now you can't, the tenure thing is in question. So therefore, it's going to impact students in two ways, right? Now, less Black and brown students are going to have the structures and systems of support and guidance that they need to successfully navigate the institution. So their graduation rates are likely going to drop. But white folks too are going to be impacted, right? Like they're getting less of a quality education. The world ain't all white. Right. And we're living in an ever globalized world, and white people think they normalize themselves because we live in America, 70% white. The world ain't that white, it's 10% white, right? And I think we're getting into an ever more globalized world. And if these white students don't learn how to deal and interact with people who don't look like them, who might not have grown up with the same ideology or frameworks as them, they're not going to be able to navigate the 21st century global workforce nearly as successfully. I don't know if they care about that, if they're thinking through that or what, but I think everybody's going to be negatively impacted by these bills.
Right. Yeah, I think there's so many intended and unintended consequences that will happen. And like you said, you're going to see things start to drop off and wonder why. You'll be able to trace it back to this. I'm also curious, you maybe think about just not that students are relying on universities potentially to create those experiences or certain experiences, but for those students who are, what advice would you have for them about how they can own that process of continuing to develop and learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and really make sure they have a more holistic, college experience without those officers being present?
Yeah, I mean, I don't. That's a good question. That's a good question. I think there's gonna be some challenges. I mean, you start cutting those support services. Yeah. If you look back at like Black Student Union from the 60s, when a lot of Black folks were just getting to campuses. If you look at the demands that these student union groups are making in the 60s, late 60s, in the 80s, in the early 2000s, and now in the 2020s, they're the same.
Yeah.
We need more support. We need more faculty, staff across campus to support us. We need less race. I mean, it's the same stuff. So now we're literally 60 years later, just continuing to cut away at the demands from 60 years ago. So we're not asking for nothing new, nothing crazy. It's the same request. We need more representation on campus to better support the students. So I think there's going to be some challenges with that, especially we know what happens in Texas and Florida generally happens across the country, specifically in the South. So that's why I'm thinking I wanted to talk about these bills. I wanted to bring them up because when the Florida bill was happening, barely anybody's talking. And then it happens here. And I'm like, are we not aware of what we're in a movement? We need to be highlighting these things and talking about these things early so that they don't sweep the South. But to answer your other question, I think what can students do? I think an easy thing a student, any individual person could do is, like, what are your core identities, right? Social identities, right? You have your race, Black, but okay, with that, you also have color, right? I'm light skinned. So my experience and your experience are very different in this world, right? I'll get back to that. So we have these social identities, race, maybe color, gender, sexuality, these different things, right? Religion. I would encourage citizenship status, language. Think about those identities that are like core to you that really impact your day-to-day experience.
Mm-hmm.
Is it privileged or is it a more oppressed?
Ooh.
Right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
and figure those out. Right? Your sexuality. I'm straight. I'm also cisgender. Those are privileged identities. So what I would encourage is when and you're honest with yourself about what is privileged and what might be oppressed in the society, and you think about your privileged identities, go and learn about the perspective, all those privileged identities you have. So for me, if it's some of my privileged identities are cisgender, straight, all right, I need to go learn about and learn from the LGBTQIA community. Okay, race, Black, oppressed, but color, light skin, privileged. If I'm out here and I just talk about blackness, 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 and I don't acknowledge the colorism privilege that I have from being light skinned or have from having a white mother, I'm doing a disservice, right? That's a privilege that I need to own. And I need to think about, all right, what is the way in the world that darker skinned people are experiencing the world that I'm not? You know, and I think when we can really sit with our privileges and just own them, it allows us to learn from those who maybe are oppressed, and then we can figure out, how do we leverage privilege to better make the world a more equitable place, right? So for me, how do I leverage my privilege of being a cisgender, heterosexual, light-skinned man? As an educator, it's easy. I damn sure talk about colorism. I damn sure talk about sexuality and homophobia. I damn sure talk about sexism and patriarchy, the history of it, the current realities of it, also solutions to it. So that's what I would encourage young people to do. Take a class based off an identity of yours. Privilege. Take a class from the perspective of an oppressed person. Go take an Asian American Studies class. You know, just some stuff.
Yeah.
I think for me, living here in Texas, one of the things that I became more aware of is the privilege of citizenship status. My first year here, I had a young woman in my class. She was 18 years old, and her dad got deported the previous year, her senior year of high school, and then her mom, understandably, she already had some drinking challenges, but then, you know, her husband gets deported, so she fell in line with that. There's a word, addiction, which is understandable. And so now it's left this 17, 18-year-old girl with raising her 3 kids. She moved, her siblings, she moved them to Austin. So I'm teaching her in class. She would be going to pick up her siblings after because of her parents' situation. And so it just made me think, like, man, these are things I never thought about being an American citizen. My wife was doing an interview with a young woman the other day. She's a citizen, but her parents and her older sister don't have citizenship status. And she asked her, she was like, yo, how often do you think about deportation? And this is a 16-year-old girl. The girl said, every single day. Wow. Every single. So imagine something like that. Like, imagine having the weight of having to think about, will your family get deported from this country every day? How are you supposed to show up in school? Or do you want your parents to come support you at an event? Are you afraid? You know what I'm saying? Like, all this stuff that I had never thought about because I was so focused on the oppression that Black people were experiencing. And that's why I'm saying sometimes we got to step outside of ourselves and think about all of our different identities, because we're all privileged in certain ways, and there's things that we can learn about the world by grappling with that privilege.
Man, that's real. You just gave me some homework. Homework. You said that, like, that is something any person can do. When you think about staff, when you think about administrators, and when you think about the mentorship that they give students, or just the counseling and day-to-day that they give to students, would you say, like, do that, and are there additional pieces because they are stewarding students along their educational journeys? Do you think that administrators and staff members are also tasked with kind of like doing that work, but thinking about how does that impact my conversation with a student? Like, what would be your suggestion for how staff people need to either add to that work or think about that work?
I think staff members, I think anybody in education needs to consistently be in a place of like retrospection, reflection, and there's always something to learn, right? So before the term woke got weaponized, I had my own little issues with the term, not the way that Republicans or conservatives do. My issue is that woke seems like as if you've landed somewhere, right? Like I'm woke.
Mm.
I get it, right? I'm like, you might get it right now, but if
Mm-hmm.
you think you get it, then that's it. Door shut, closed. I get it. I get people. I'm woke. I understand people. Cool. Moving on. It's like, nah, like you got to be waking up every day. You got to be
Mm.
waking up every day. Every day you got to wake up and you got to think about like, how do I become more aware about the world around me? Because when I was in middle school, I remember telling my dad, like when sexuality is starting to perk up in middle school and stuff. And I remember
Mm-hmm.
coming up one day, I'm like, yo, pops, man, like twice this week, different girls kissed each other. I'm like, I didn't even know girls be kissing each other like that. He's like, for real? I'm like, he's like, do boys be kissing each other too? I'm like, nah, I haven't heard nothing like that. But I'm like, I guess there's two sets of lesbians at my school, right? 12 years old. And his mind is kind of blown because when he was in school, that type of stuff wasn't
Mm.
really happening, right?
Right.
So now 25 years later, now that I'm adult and I have my child in middle school and high school,
Mm-hmm.
she's coming home. It's a different conversation. Now it's gender identity. We have different words, cisgender,
Ah.
trans.
Yep.
So if somebody would have thought they got it just because they're open to lesbians 20 years ago, now it's a whole different conversation. We gender and sexuality has to continue to evolve, and it will continue to evolve. And I think we always got to be waking up to that reality, right? Like, for example, right now, like the intersection of like Black trans women, getting murdered at astronomical rates, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you feel like, oh, I support Black people or I support gay people, trans issue you're still trying to figure out, right? Like you have waking up to do.
Yeah.
You have work to learn, to grow, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? But I think as soon as we think we made it, that's when we become a problem. We get so comfortable and we think we have the answers. So I feel like educators who are always working with young people, right? Like always working with the newest generation, the newest issues, newest challenges, identities, whatever they be. You have to be in a conscious space of reflection and making sure that you're showing up and you've been reflecting on your own identities and the way they've been shaped and socialized in a way that you don't put that onto the kid. For example, like my wife the other day, like she comes home and she's like, you know what I realized? I don't think I read enough about authors from outside of America. I'm like, okay. She's like, yeah, I'm going to start reading some more books for authors, women authors outside of the States. Okay, cool. But that's an example of that, right? It's like being aware of like, where are her biases? When she thinks of knowledge, she thinks of American authors, right? Those are the people she taps into. And being aware enough to be realized like, nah, there's more to the world, right? Like, let me go read a Muslim author, female author from Syria, see how she sees the world, right? And maybe that'll impact and change and influence how I show up the next time I'm on a college campus. So as I say, there's always work to be done. That's the good thing about, when you're on this side of trying to fight for social justice or equity or whatever one wants to call it, humanity, really. There's always going to be work to be done.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, that's amazing. I have work to do. We all do. And like you said, it's never a process where I've learned enough. I'm done. I'm good now. It's that constant cycle of self-reflection.
Before you jump, can I get another story?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So when I worked at Posse, I want to go back. Kids come in and we interview them. They have a 20-minute interview. And the second round, they've already made the first round. There's the second round. From here, if we rank them high, they go into a pool of 25 and 10 of them get this full tuition scholarship to college. So this interview is important, right? For a 17-year-old, this is probably the most important interview they've had in their entire life. It's only 20 minutes. Student comes in, they're my next student. I'm reading their file and they walk in the building and I'm like, okay, that's my student. I look up again, I'm like, wait, is that a boy or a girl? Right? Like, who is this? Here it says boy or male, but when I look at this person, I see a woman. So immediately I get uncomfortable, right? I'm like, I'm trying to put them in a box. I'm trying to figure it out. And I'm like, oh, I'm uncomfortable because the reality is, although I grew up in LA, which is a very open-minded space, in terms of my interactions with people who were of the trans community, it was generally in some sort of like service interaction, right? Like they might be the waiter or the waitress. They might
Gotcha.
be a store clerk. You know what I'm saying? It was very transactional.
Right.
This is not that. I have to interview this kid. I have 20 minutes to make sure that this kid can do his best job of laying out who they are. How am I supposed to do that if I'm stereotyping this kid is this the moment he walks in? How am I supposed to make them comfortable enough to tell me who they are if I've already got my mind like, ooh, right? My heart's beating fast. So I literally, I'm in my office, so I kind of go over to a little area. I check myself. I name Devin. You're getting uncomfortable because I don't think you're that comfortable around trans people. Okay, name that. You have work to do. Okay. So since I know that about myself, I don't have that many trans friends, right? At this point in my life, I don't know their experiences in the world. I haven't read any books. I haven't taken, I did take a class in college, and I knew I did have a friend in college, an associate, I would say, who was trans. So I'm trying to check myself. So either way, I go, I meet this kid, dope interview. I put myself in a place to just really focus on the kid. A couple of things that he said that were really shocking or hurtful. He was the president of his school. He had been jumped 3 times his senior year, and he's the president. Wow. Due to the levels of homophobia that he was experiencing. So he gets the scholarship to Berkeley, and he was incredible. I ranked him as high as I could rank him. Dude was just on it. And he shows up at the award ceremony, and he's just dressed like a cisgender man, right? Just dressed like a man. Okay. So they start, does anybody want to talk, give thanks, and then they eventually give that opportunity to the students on the stage, and he raises his hand, and he, gets the mic, and he looks over at me. I'm sitting in the audience, and he's like, when I heard about this organization, I didn't know what y'all stood for. I didn't know your values or anything. So when I came to my interview, I wanted to see what you all were all about. So I wore, I dressed up in my trans outfit. Sometimes I dress up, drag or trans, or I can't remember the terminology back then. So I'm like, oh shit, right? My heart is starting to beat up. Like I must have done something wrong. I did that, right? Like I'm like, Jesus. And he ends up sharing that, when he came in, he was nervous, but ultimately, and he literally calls me out. He says my name. He's like, Devin, when you interviewed me, you just looked me in my face. He was like, everything else, my nails, my hair. So it was almost like you didn't see it. It was like you were looking at me as a person, like, who am I? You really wanted to get to know me and my experiences in this world. And I just really appreciate you for that. And it gave me trust that I could trust this organization to go to school with for the next 4 years, because school hasn't always been a safe place for me, right? And so I'm sitting there, I started like damn near tearing up, and I'm like, it was so impactful because, and I know I've talked a long time to get here, but it's like, we always have growth. And I'm like, man, if I was able to impact this kid in that way, right, and help him get this scholarship, or at least didn't become a barrier for him getting the scholarship. And I know I still have so much work to do in this particular area. Like, damn, imagine how impactful I might be able to be in society if I continue to learn and grow about other people and become an ally or an advocate, or at least not a barrier. So that, again, that goes all the way back to like the idea of woke, or like always being able to wake up and like learn something new and grow. Like we always can grow, especially as educators. I think it's essential.
With the courses that you took, with the experiences that you've had, I can imagine like you were quote unquote prepared, so to speak, for that moment. What would be, and this is my second to last question, what would be your advice for that person who is like not prepared at all for that moment and had that same feeling you had and is completely stuck about how to even navigate it? What should they do in that moment?
Stop making it about them. Your job as an educator is to serve, to pull out. So if you realize that there's a certain population of students that you are not as good at serving because of something you're carrying, you also got to realize like, all right, that means that other people are also having this experience. So that means these kids are not being served nearly as much as the other kid because those of us have these issues. You don't have to be perfect. I'm not perfect on any issue, but I'm not going to be afraid to have a conversation with somebody and ask them how they're experiencing life today based on who they are, you know, and being willing to make a mistake because you know your heart's in the right place. Like, I've made mistakes when I talk to students, especially of different communities or who are oppressed in different ways than I'm not. I've made mistakes in asking questions or phrasing things or whatever, but I'm not afraid to make mistakes, because if I'm afraid to make mistakes, I'm going to be afraid to serve that student. So then I'm replicating the harm and oppression done onto that student. And my fear of doing the wrong thing is actually making me somewhat of a bigot. So I'll say, get over yourself. I experience this so much in international education as it's diversifying, but the field is so white and white women oriented. When I present at conferences, or people always want to ask me about, like, well, you know, how do we kind of talk to this new student, you know, a Black girl in Europe, you know, she's going to experience certain things, and read about a Black woman's experience. Go to places where you are uncomfortable, learn, read, grow, engage in conversation. Don't have the same issue 2.5 years later. If you couldn't talk to a Black girl 2 years ago and you still can't 2.5 years later, you got to get the hell out of education. Because you are unwilling to learn and to grow yourself, right? Like, we have to be the first to learn and grow. Because how do we inspire that in young people if we ourselves have these blinders or these points that we can't get past? And there's so many examples I could throw at as it relates to that. But yeah, man, folks got to get over themselves. And I think one of the best ways to do that is reading, because reading is personal. You can jot down your own ideas. You could, for a book, for example, you can throw that book into Google and get other people's perspectives. So you can work and grow through your biases privately, right? And I think that's what those people really need to do. If you have those biases, you got to work through them privately before you go put it on somebody else, right? Like, I hate when like white folks come up to me like, man, you know, I'm really trying to learn. Like, tell me what it's like to be a Black person in this country. I'm like, motherfucker, go read a book first. Highlight a few sections that you find interesting or you want to better understand, then come back to me and we can have that conversation. But if you just straight up want to learn about racism from my experience, I'm like, come on, man, like, you got some work to do first.
Right.
So in that same regard, I just think educators, when you find yourself in a place of discomfort where you don't feel confident engaging with a student or engaging on a topic or engaging on that student experience, go learn more about that experience. Honestly, it's pretty easy. It's like 1 + 1 = 2. But if you stay stuck and you don't go learn, then you'll never grow. And you'll never be able to serve that student.
Thank you for that. My last question, I end every podcast interview with this question. I want you to imagine I'm giving you a magic wand and you can make any change. Yep, you could make any change in education that you want. What change or changes would you make?
Oh my God, I don't even know if I can answer that question. Education is so big.
Right.
Here's what I'll say. Here's what I'm passionate about. I wish that every American student, specifically Black student, I wish every Black student had an opportunity to go on some sort of birthright trip, like Jewish, right? Like the state of Israel, before you turn 25 or 27, if you can prove your Jewish identity, you get a free 2-week trip to Israel. And I'm sure there's a lot of indoctrination and propaganda and blah, 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 trying to, you know, support the Israeli state. But either way, I get it. And I'm cool. I want every Black kid to have that somewhere in the diaspora, right? Whether that be going back to West Africa, to Dakar, Senegal, or, you know, Accra, Ghana, South Africa, or maybe it's Panama or Cuba, right? Somewhere within the diaspora, so you could realize that we are a global people. And aspects of our experience globally are connected due to anti-Blackness, but I think it's so empowering and so liberating to step outside of this country and realize like, what is Blackness globally? So I think I feel that way. That my passion is that for Black students, and I want to help create that opportunities for that to happen. But I really think all American students need to experience life or education outside of this country, because kind of like I was talking about before, you know, I think when Black students really go abroad, they're forced to confront this American identity and all the privileges associated to it that in this country, being Black, you don't always see, you don't always think about, you don't experience, because you're so focused on the racism that you experience from being Black. But you go abroad, there's a lot of privileges you get, this American passport, all these different things, you know, don't need a visa to most countries, you could just show up and get in. It's important for Black Americans to experience that and to force to be grappling with what are the ways in which your identities are also privileged, which maybe you haven't thought about, right? Because globally they are. In the same way we want all white folks accountable to their privilege and for them to think about it so they can be aware, because it impacts so many things. We are the same. We need to be aware of that stuff because it impacts decisions we make. For me, it impacts the clothes, how much clothes I buy, how many products, things, right? I mean, consumerism, little stuff, or big stuff. So I wish every student had an opportunity to experience something like that. I think 17 would be a great age to have an experience like that. And ultimately, you know, that's what I'm trying to do in my organization, World Walker, both an LLC and I also have World Walker Foundation, depending on the type of business somebody wants to do. And I'm, you know, my goal is to curate trips to and through the diaspora, catered towards Black students. So yeah, man, that's my magic wand piece. And then maybe all the business comes through me, so then I'd be balling too. So there you go.
There you go. That'll work. That'll work. Dr. Walker, I really appreciate this discussion. You definitely pushed my thinking. I know anybody that listens to this, we all got some homework and some work to continue to do. It's never ending. Before we really close out, how can people get to you? I mean, your organization is going to be already doing great things. How can people reach you? How can people connect with you?
Yeah, certainly. So Instagram, worldwalker85. My website is worldwalker.org. My email is devin@worldwalker.org. Would love to connect. You know, I really am trying to build out the dream. That's my goal right now. And both for myself, but also, as I was saying, like as an educator, we are models for the next generation, right? So me living out my dream is going to inspire the next young Black kid to live out their dream. So yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. I love getting Black students abroad, love making these international connections. I just left 12 students in Senegal. They're doing internships there for 2 months. I was out there with them for 10 days, left them out there. They have companies they're working with, they're living together, they're getting paid. And for me, I'm taking a moment of privilege here. I know this wasn't the question, but to me, something like that is critical because it does multiple things. It gives these Black students internship experience for their own professional trajectory, paid internship experience, because a lot of times Black students don't get paid internships. They can't afford the unpaid one, so it puts them behind the 8 ball when they're in college in terms of their professional development. But bigger than that, when they come back, they are now ambassadors of their experience in West Africa. So instead of people learning about West Africa through a white lens, they get to learn about through these students. But these students didn't go volunteer, right? They didn't go on a safari. They went and had professional experiences. They were working with organizations, big ones, startups, small ones, right? It's a professionalized experience. And I think that changes the conversation and the discourse and the narrative that we typically fall in line with when it comes to West Africa or Africa. So I want to change the discourse, the narrative. When we talk about that region of the world, do we ever talk about like, oh, the homie came back from a professional internship? Nah, you might think about that London, Paris, maybe Beijing, but you don't think about professional internships in West Africa. So that to challenge the narrative, but then also to build as these young people who are 18 to 21 having these experiences, as they get older and they become leaders within their fields and industries, now they have these relationships over here and they have this network. So hopefully we can continue to do more business and raise both communities simultaneously in like true partnership. Like what is going to work for both communities? Because everybody else is investing in West Africa or extracting from West Africa. I don't want to contribute to the extraction, but I do want to contribute towards mutual investment that is supportive of both communities. And I think for me, that mission is far bigger than myself or my organization. Like that is part of hopefully the new world, maybe in 150 years from now, 20 years, who knows, where Africa reclaims its spot at the top of the hierarchy, you know. Even as an American, I'm very happy and looking forward to that day when that happens.
Oh man, thank you. I can't wait to see your vision continue to come to fruition. You're already doing it with students and just going to scale that up. Thank you again for your time, Dr. Walker. Thank y'all for tuning in. Look, if you have questions for Dr. Walker, make sure that you reach out. I'll make sure to post his contact information. Share this out with people, and I will see y'all on the other side of graduation. Have a good one.